the real 24 hours in the life of a Viking. Forget everything you think you know about the Vikings. Forget the horned helmets, they never wore them. Forget the image of mindless, bloodthirsty savages who spent every waking hour screaming at the sky and hacking down monastery doors. Yes, the word Viking itself comes from an Old Norse word meaning raider or pirate. And yes, when they raided, they did it with terrifying, ruthless efficiency. But for the vast majority of the people living in Scandinavia between 793 and 1066 AD, raiding wasn't a daily job. It wasn't even an annual one. In fact, most Norsemen and women never went on a single raid in their entire lives. So, if they weren't busy terrorizing Europe, what were they doing? They were farmers, navigators, traders, poets, and fiercely organized lawmakers. Today, we're stepping past the Hollywood smoke and mirrors to look at the bizarre, brutal, and surprisingly structured reality of a day in the life of an average Viking. And trust us, the reality is far more fascinating than the fantasy. Chapter 1. Waking Up in the Longhouse. Dawn. It is 5:30 a.m. in the year 980 AD. The air inside the longhouse is thick, heavy, and smells powerfully of wood smoke, damp wool, fermented dairy, dried fish, and animal breath. Because in the Viking world, privacy didn't exist. The wealthiest families might have had a separate room to avoid being stepped on by livestock, but for the average person, the animals were your roommates. The Viking day begins before dawn, and the very first task always belongs to the fire. As the hearth is brought back to life, breakfast is prepared. Unlike the rest of medieval Europe, where peasants barely scraped by on weak vegetable broth, the average Viking actually ate incredibly well. They had a protein-heavy, robust diet. Breakfast, called the dagmal, is served shortly after waking. Typically, it's a hearty porridge made of oats or barley, topped with dried fruits and washed down with buttermilk or a light sour beer. Everyone in the household has a job from the moment their feet hit the dirt floor. Children don't go to school, they are apprentices to survival. Young girls help mend wool and prep food, while young boys are sent to check the livestock or grind grain. But as the family finishes breakfast, the household splits by class and gender, and this is where the daily labor truly begins.
Chapter 2. The Grunt Work, from morning to afternoon. Viking society was strictly divided into three distinct social classes: the Jarls at the top, wealthy aristocratic landowners; the Karls in the middle, free farmers, craftsmen, and merchants; and the Thralls at the very bottom. Thralls were slaves, either born into it or captured during overseas raids. And if you want to know who did the most grueling, back-breaking labor in the frozen Scandinavian landscape, it was them. While the free Karl men managed the estate, handled specialized metalworking, or built ships, the Thralls were forced to do the arduous work of plowing the earth in freezing weather, clearing rocks, and carrying heavy loads. Meanwhile, back at the homestead, the woman of the house is running what amounts to a small factory. In Viking culture, women held a remarkable degree of legal and social power compared to their European neighbors. The housewife was the absolute boss of the domestic front. She literally carried the keys to the property on her clothing as a symbol of authority. She managed the larder, calculated food ratios to ensure the family didn't starve during the brutal winter, and took full control of the farm whenever the men went away on trading voyages or seasonal raids. One of her most vital jobs was textile production. Every shirt, pair of trousers, cloak, and, most importantly, the massive, heavy sails for the longships had to be spun and woven by hand out of wool. Without the women weaving the sails, the Viking Age literally could not have sailed forward. But life wasn't without its harsh rules. While a man was socially permitted to keep concubines, a wife's adultery was treated with extreme severity. However, Norse women had rights their English counterparts could only dream of. They could own property, inherit wealth, and legally divorce their husbands through a surprisingly simple process, merely calling witnesses and declaring themselves divorced at the front door. Chapter 3. The Highway of Sea and Law. By midday, down at the water's edge, a longship is being loaded. But look closely at the cargo. It isn't broadswords and chainmail. It's walrus ivory, animal furs, dried cod, and iron ore. Scandinavia's inland was a nightmare of rugged mountains and impenetrable forests, making travel by land almost impossible. To the Vikings, the sea wasn't a barrier, it was a highway. Their longships were engineering masterpieces, capable of crossing the fierce, open Atlantic Ocean to reach North America 5 centuries before Columbus, yet shallow enough to float up rivers where a child could wade. They used these ships to establish a trade network that stretched from the icy shores of Greenland all the way to the bustling markets of Baghdad. But let's say it's a special day of the year, the Day of the Thing. The Thing was the Viking Assembly, an outdoor parliament where every free man had the right to show up, voice his opinion, and vote on laws. The entire system relied on a lagsugamather, or law speaker, whose sole job was to memorize the entire legal code word for word and recite it to the public. If you had a dispute with a neighbor over property or an insult, you brought it here. If the law couldn't settle it, or you wanted to defend your honor directly, you engaged in a holmganga, a legally sanctioned, highly ritualized duel fought with swords and shields that often went to the first blood, or the death. As the sun dips below the fjords, the physical labor stops, and the second meal of the day, the nattmal, or night meal, begins. And if it's a festival night, a wedding, or a celebration of a successful voyage, a Viking feast is a sight to behold. The tables are overflowing with meats. Pork was the favorite, alongside beef, mutton, and occasionally bear. They seasoned their food with cumin, coriander, mustard, and horseradish. But the real star of the night, the alcohol. They drank ale, but for special occasions, they drank mead, a potent, sweet drink made from fermented honey, water, and yeast. Mead was so central to their culture that in Norse mythology, there is a magical goat named Hadron who stands on top of Valhalla and lactates endless streams of mead instead of milk. But feasts weren't just an excuse to get drunk. They were vital political arenas where alliances were forged, oaths were sworn, and social bonds were glued together. As the night deepens, the crowd falls silent for the most respected entertainer in the Norse world, the Skald. Skalds were professional poets who memorized massive oral histories, reciting them in incredibly complex, rigid verse structures. They used beautiful riddles called kennings to describe the world. They wouldn't just say the sea, they called it the whale road. They wouldn't say gold, they called it the fire of the Rhine. And they wouldn't say death, they called it the sleep of the sword. Through these poems, the deeds of ancestors were kept alive, and the complex stories of the gods, of Odin hanging himself from the world tree for knowledge, of Thor protecting the common people, and of Loki's trickery were passed down to the next generation.
By 10 p.m., the longhouse goes dark. The free men, the wives, the children, the thralls, and the livestock settle in for a few hours of hard-earned rest before the cycle repeats at dawn. The Viking Age didn't end with a cataclysmic explosion or a grand final battle. Instead, it melted away. Over 3 centuries, exposure to the rest of Europe brought Christianity to Scandinavia. The small, independent farmsteads consolidated into larger kingdoms, and the economic necessity of seasonal raiding faded into history. But the Vikings never truly vanished. They assimilated, becoming the Normans, the Rus, the English, and the Irish. They left their marks so deeply embedded in our world that nearly a third of the modern English vocabulary, including everyday words like sky, knife, cake, husband, and even the days of our week, like Thursday, Thorsday, comes directly from Old Norse. So the next time you picture a Viking, Don't just see a warrior covered in blood wearing a fake horned helmet. See the farmer pulling a plow through frozen dirt, the woman weaving the sail that would cross an ocean, and the poet shouting verses into the smoke of a crowded longhouse. Because their true history is far grander, far weirder, and far more epic than any movie could ever capture.